Much appreciated. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session. My background is I'm a senior executive in housing and regeneration. I've worked in the private sector over a number of years, also worked in the housing sector at senior executive roles, and more recently in local government, particularly focused on housing and regeneration. So what I want to talk about is lots of talk in the markets at the moment about housing and regeneration. We've got a new government, so I want to talk about how we need to think strategically and rethink about our operating models that enable us to impact on what the government's ambitions are over the coming next 5 years. I think the big headlines last week in the budget was going to bring another 500 million into housing developments and growth across the country. A 5-year rent settlement, which is really important, particularly for the housing sector, in understanding how their business model and financial models will perform at least over the next 5 years. So that creates some certainty, and it creates some certainty of the funding markets in terms of viability of organisations. Also announced around planning reform on policy, up to 300 new planners that are going to come into the planning profession. But I'm sure that's going to take quite a while to follow through. And then we're going to see the release of Grey Belt being released for more housing development. So expectation that there's going to be an additional land availability for development that was not normally allowed for. Having said that, the government is expecting over the next 5 years 1.5 million new homes to be built. So how, in that context, how's the market been operating over the last number of years, and how has it responded to these government announcements? Well, if you've been looking in over the last 12 months in terms of Section 106 activity, and particularly in London, we're most seeing a slowdown of Section 106 developments taking forward, and RPs slowing down their development activity. A lot of that is to do with the fact that they are now refocusing, reinvesting in their existing assets given to the new consumer standards. So that's impacting on development capability. The regulators just recently announced the housing sector risk profile, setting out that both councils and RPs are financially, their finances have intensified quite substantially. So that's putting pressures on the ability to finance development. However, the sector in response has welcomed the budget. It's welcomed the 500 million for new homes. The private house builder sector is similar, mixed views, but concerned about the increase in overheads on national insurance and the supply of skills in the sector. But when you go back to the ranch and think about it as whether you're in a council or in an RP, what is those organisations facing at this moment in time? A lot of councils are faced with Section 114 notices, particularly in London. That replicates itself in homelessness challenges and the increasing demand pressures. The introduction of the new consumer standards, particularly those organisations that have just insourced the Alamos, the impact of fire safety, all these things are putting pressure on the headroom in a council or RP dealing with these things. But there is an expectation the government is going to see this scale of development, which Homes England announced yesterday would be the biggest rate of house building in a generation. We'll see councils and combined authorities as probably the major leaders in delivery of this new supply of 1.5 million of houses. So the question here is then how our councils can respond to this strategic response that they need to consider. For me, this is about shifting the operating models and thinking about, and in the RP sector, it's about thinking about their business acumen in terms of how their operating models work. What we're seeing is in housing regeneration, that councils are very good enablers in regeneration. RPs are very good deliverers of housing supply. That's their expertise. They have very strong development capability in their organisations. And with both organisations facing financial risks and investment challenges in other parts of their organisation, this is about how can you increase capacity when we find ourselves both in councils having a shortage of capacity, its ability to recruit, and the existing capacity in those organisations to meet this demand of an additional 1.5 million. So for me, this strategic thinking around this, as one example, has to be around the collaboration of strengths and skills. When you see a slowdown of RP's development activity and you see an issue of capacity in councils, then there is an opportunity here to see greater collaboration. I'm not talking about land collaborations, I'm talking about skills and operation collaboration, mixing the strengths and skills of both types of both organisations that can come together, because it will be strategic partnerships that gets up to the 1.5 million. And when we think about, councils are excellent at placemaking, they're great at economic development in places, great at land use identification and master planning. If you switch to RPs, very good at delivery, project management, cost management control, product design, all the strengths that you need in house building to be able to develop at pace and to be able to develop site from site to site in a very progressive way. So by bringing those two sets of skills together, you can begin to see there is a role for both councils and RPs to come together operationally, that sees the strength of a council in placemaking, repurposing assets next to RPs that are going to have some capacity, if they're downsizing their development activity, to be able to think about how they can work more closely with councils. That will then see, I think, and I know over the last couple of weeks we've seen Homes England been talking to the sectors, institutions and private sectors, and been announcing some big strategic partnerships, particularly with the private sector. Here's an opportunity for local authority to play a key role in forming those strategic partnerships with RPs. And I would suggest that those RPs need to be very much land-led, who've got that land-led experience and knowing how to turn a difficult site into a development site and bringing it forward. The other aspect of this is around funding. While both types of organisation are restrictive in funding at the moment, and again, the regulator is setting out and has identified that both councils and RPs are suffering from a reduction in their headrooms. While in RPs, the liquidity is very good, but the interest cover both in local government and in housing associations is reducing rapidly. This needs some thinking from a government point of view in terms of how funding structures need to be pulled together to deal with that problem of funding criteria that enables an organisation to borrow more into it. So I think one of the key issues that need to be addressed over the coming months, and particularly into the spring, will be how is the government going to support both funding institutions and both councils and RPs to be able to put the funding in place with all this additional grant that actually works financially. What I've set out is how you can deal with it strategically and operationally, but the question that needs to be addressed on top of this will be how do we go forward with funding? Do we relax the interest cover that RPs operate under to allow more funding to be poured in? Because they've got a lot of headroom around liquidity in their business models, but they're starting to get worried about their covenants, their lending covenants within the structure. The other big question here for me is how do funders carry some risk as well? Because in many funding agreements, the risk sits with the borrower. So we need to think about how funders carry the risk and build that into their own financial models to enable and free up capacity and funding capacity to be able to see a development take place. The other big announcement that we heard last week is planning. A lot to talk about planning reform. Great news to see that there's going to be 300 new planners, but as I've mentioned earlier on, that's going to be some time till those planners filter through, when we've already seen in the sector a shortage of planners. to enable us to increase capacity in our planning departments. But also £50 million was announced last week to supercharge planning and planning reform. But there are other aspects of planning that need to be considered. My experience in leading planning departments, we've got a number of factors to take into consideration. How do we speed up the planning process that de-risks developers? Because, developers operating today, whether it's in the centre of London or other conurbations, the margins of profit are much tighter. So the timescale for delivery is much more focused. The longer it takes to get your planning application, the more it costs, and the more risk and the more lack of confidence developers will have. That has been my experience. But there's another factor, and maybe an elephant in the room. Planners are brilliant and very skilled in going through planning policy, understanding planning law. What we don't see is planners being enabled and empowered to be flexible around policy in making development decisions. The other aspect for me is culture in planning. Planners are trained in planning law and policy. What we need to see is a switch towards planners being more considered, more trained around placemaking and the economic value of development taking place. There are situations where schemes have not secured planning based purely on policy, when there's been real opportunity for real economic growth. We're seeing a lot of talk at the moment about life sciences. Governments are talking about life sciences. In my experience, and more recently, it took 3 months to get a planning Section 106 agreement on over life sciences that actually ran the risk of both the health department and the university engaged with the health department and NH Property Services actually considering pulling out and not developing. So I think planners have to be empowered to think more economically, thinking more around the economics of development, and need to think about the impact of development, not just on what's present and what's past, but what the future will bring through that development activity. We know regeneration in scale creates growth, creates wealth, creates investors' confidence. Really important points to make. So I think as we think about this planning reform and the turbocharging of planning policy, the strategic thinking around that needs to think about how do we enable the speed up. One is to fast track planning through a pre-planning service. The second is to introduce a change in culture that allows planners to feel more confident and empowered to think as a placemaker, not just in the context of policy.
Alex. So my name is Britton. I'm currently Interim Executive Director for Place at Dorset Council, but I've been around local government for a while, worked in the Midlands, worked in Buckinghamshire, London over the years, almost always in place-related roles, and indeed, even when I was Chief Executive of Council in the West Midlands, I did a great deal of work around housing and regeneration. So spent most of my career in and around this sort of space. And I joined Dorset 12 months ago to look at the council's place directorate, really looking at the place directorate from the other end of the telescope that Paul has been talking about. And it's perhaps that other end of the telescope that I'm going to concentrate on. So place services in Dorset are pretty much what you'd expect. We've got planning, highway, waste management, economic development, assets and property related services. The only part of the sort of place structure that we would recognise that isn't within the directorate is actually housing, which in Dorset structure sits with adult social care, which sort of says more about Dorset than it does very much else. Dorset, probably the most aged county in England, and the link between housing and social care is a real pressure. But for the rest of the place directorate, about a 250 million turnover operation, so that gives you an idea of the scale of it. And I think we're something like the 6th or 7th biggest local planning authority in England. So I'm going to talk a fair bit about planning and pick up some of the questions that have been made. And in some of what I'm going to talk about, you'll probably recognise themes about capacity, about looking at the operating model, and about collaboration that Paul has referred to, but if you like, coming from the Place Directorate level. So key moment for Dorset now. We're 5 years into Dorset Council having been created through local government reorganisation. So the new Dorset Council was the combination of the former county council and 6 district councils. And in May this year, the council had its first all-out election following the election when the council was created. And if that wasn't a big enough milestone, the council also moved from Conservative control prior to May to a new Liberal Democrat administration in May. And that new administration is currently bedding itself in, looking to the future, and particularly expressing its ambitions around place shaping, place making, and where they want Dorset to go for the future. The Dorset, the place, is very much part of their political thinking. And yet what they've inherited in the council is a place directorate that is largely, until recently, largely unchanged from what was brought together when the unitary council was created. You could almost, when I arrived in January, you could almost feel in the air which part of the former county council or which of the former district councils a part of the place directorate had come from and been sort of pushed together at local government reorganisation. There was very much a sense in which the place directorate was the repository for a lot of all the other things that weren't adult social care or children's, but was managed very much as a basket of only lightly related services. It was there wasn't a great deal of sense of strategy. And one of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit today is the importance of having a narrative for place. What are you trying to achieve with your place directorate? Not what are you doing in highways, what are you doing in waste management, what are you doing in property, whatever it might be, but what's the overarching narrative that links services together? Because I think that is where Dorset was struggling, and in my experience it's where the place shaping role sort of comes from, and I think it's quite important with the challenges that Paul has described, with the budget pressures that we're facing, that we're able to develop an overarching narrative for what these services mean, what their purpose and their objective is, that links in with the council plan, links in with the strategic objective, and indeed, following some of the comments that have been made, links up into the discussion at the combined authority and the regional level as well. So, against Dorset's position, Dorset financially relatively stable, relatively soundly financially, but even when I joined in January, you could look ahead, couple of years' time, the cliff edge getting a bit closer, a growing sense in which the waste services were previously delivered isn't going to be affordable in that way for very much longer. So part of the challenge I was asked to look at as an incoming interim was to make more strategic sense of this basket of partially related services, and to look at what the priorities are and what that means in the face of budget reductions in the order of 10, 15, 20% in the next 2 or 3 years. And in the old manner of those services, in the basket of services only partially related to each other, 10, 20% reductions would have been pretty disastrous. They would have been nothing more than old style salami slicing. So the conversation, the challenge that I was asked to look at is, how do you move beyond that? How do place services coalesce? How do they develop a narrative around what we're trying to achieve, around what the priorities are, and how does that then drive into the making of budget reductions, efficiency savings, and from there into that conversation that Paul raised around, priorities, effectiveness, resourcing, partnership working and capacity at a time when our own budgets are being, squeezed down. How do we increase the capacity to deliver when in the traditional model, capacity equal budget and budget equal capacity, and that is no longer available to us. Now, fortunately, in arriving in Dorset, I was able to immediately look at one area where very creditable improvement and change had been made, and an example to other services in the Place Directorate, and that is planning. The former County Council and 6 District Council planning departments have been successfully brought together over the last 5 years into one planning authority. Still working on local plan. It would help if the government stopped changing the rules around local plan. We would all benefit if they'd slow down the pace of government thinking on planning and decide what they actually want. But actually quite a radical approach to bringing a planning department together. Strong investment in IT, in digital, strong investment in communication, and perhaps critically, a disaggregation of the planning function to say that, yes, within the planning function, there are some things that only a qualified planning officer can do. But actually, if you want to speed up planning, if you want to streamline planning in the way that Paul has referred to, and indeed, if you want to address the challenge of not having sufficient planning officers, there are quite significant elements of the planning process that don't need a qualified chartered planning officer. So, for example, in the Dorset model, I'm sure with others as well, the verification process is handled by well-trained, experienced business support staff, not in the hand of planning officers. And looking at the planning process as a whole, looking at it as a series of handoff points between different functions and streamlining those functions and making them work together, has actually made Dorset, notwithstanding the size, as I say, 6th or 7th largest planning authority in England, also one of the most efficient. So I was able, when I arrived at Dorset, to point at something and say, look, if you can bring that sort of improvement, that sort of efficiency to everything we do across the Place Directorate, we'll make big gains, and there'll be gains, not cuts. We're able to mobilize the efficiency to deliver the capacity we need without asking for more money, and indeed to some extent mitigate against the budget reductions we're likely to have to make. So we started off back in February, March time, having a whole series of staff events, staff conferences, discussions, not about individual service areas, but about the themes, the themes that unite the Place Directorate, the things that make us, which make the component parts of place contribute to a bigger picture. Discussions about placemaking, discussions about nature recovery, discussions about Dorset's economy, discussions about climate change and carbon, and actually using those themes, using those cross-cutting themes as a way of introducing people who, many of them worked together for years and years, but not really worked together. People who knew each other, people in highways, people in planning, people in economic development, and actually encouraging them to have a cross-cutting conversation about the things that link their service areas together and make us a joined up narrative around what placemaking and place shaping is about. And through that process, we began and are in the process now of breaking down those service silos, breaking down the boundaries that have kept colleagues who've worked together for a long time but not really engaged with each other, and actually saying the way of the future in this joined up Place Directorate is not to look at the vertical silos of service, not to look at planning, not to look at highways, not to look at waste management, not to look at economic development, but to start looking at these areas of work thematically across the board. And if we do that, we begin to create the sort of capacity that Paul's talking about. We begin to open ourselves up. We become more able and better able to engage in those external partnerships that we want to take advantage of. And we all round become more resilient. And in doing that, in fostering that conversation, in fostering that sort of joined up, cross-cutting approach, we're also building a narrative about the Place Directorate, about why we're here, about what's important, and about how what we do contributes not just to the wider work of the council, but the sort of health and well-being of Dorset, the place, as a whole. I mean, in many respects, I sort of dislike the old meme about the cleaner at NASA, who, you know, when the cleaner at NASA was asked what's your job, and the cleaner at NASA's response is, well, I'm helping to put someone on the moon. And it's such a hackneyed old meme, but actually that's what we've been doing. We've been talking across the boundaries of the service, not to say I deal with planning applications or I make sure people's waste is collected or that potholes are filled, but about what we're contributing to climate change, about what we're contributing to Dorset's economy, about what we're contributing to making Dorset a better place to live and to work and to visit. And we're seeing the reward in that. That's flourishing into a new sense of the Place Directorate not just being that basket of semi-related services, but something that is a more joined up whole with a stronger narrative about why we're here and why what we're doing is important. And we're now taking that out. And by taking that out, I mean outside the bounds of the Place Directorate, and we're engaging with our colleagues in adult social care, we're engaging in children's services in a different conversation. We're no longer the sort of depot-bound yellow lorry brigade who are only interested in planning permissions, but we're having a more strategic conversation with our colleagues in other parts of the council about how our strategic objectives relate strongly to theirs and join up. And in doing that, we've also begun much more strongly to have the discussion outside the council. Now, at the moment, my priority is not so much Homes England. Paul referred to Homes England. It's not yet a combined authority because Dorset isn't quite there yet, although our expression of interest for a combined authority is on the government's desk. Actually, one of the key external partners I've got to crack are Dorset's many town and parish councils. I mean, Lord knows how many there are. It's 200 or more, I think. But place services have been impenetrable to town and parish councils for, I think, as long as Dorset Council has existed, but maybe longer. The county council may well have had similar challenges. But by talking more thematically, by talking about places and place shaping, we're beginning to have a conversation with town and parish councils on their own terms, on terms that they understand, rather than expecting them to sort of penetrate the barrier and the mystery of the structure of the higher tier authority. And that is paying us a big reward. We're beginning to find common ground. Sometimes it's common ground where we're saying to a town council, we can do that for you, and we can do it more economically for you than you can do it for yourselves. In other cases, it's us saying to the town council, you're doing that better than we are. Why don't we give you some funding to take it further? So it's very much a two-way dialogue. But by opening up that narrative about the bigger outcome, the thematic outcome, we're having much richer conversations with those external partners. And, going into the combined authority, going into a situation where we're talking to Wiltshire, we're talking to Somerset, we're talking to our neighbours in Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council, that thematic approach very much to me seems the way to discuss and to handle the strategic combined authority discussion. And it does, I think it was Nigel, were you saying earlier about empowering combined authorities to be the engine for some of that growth. If it wasn't Nigel, I apologise, but somebody made that comment. If we have that more open, more transparent thematic conversation about what we're trying to achieve, that move into the combined authority world has got the potential to address some of the questions that Paul is raising. I think if we go into that world and stick in the place of rather old style thematic, old style departmental silos, we just have the same problem but on a bigger scale. So we're trying to change the narrative, and I think in Dorset we're being successful in doing that. And while I think it's a bit too early to say that we've transformed the Place Directorate, I think the sense in which we are signing up to a bigger picture than just the processing of planning applications or the collecting of bins or the filling of potholes, that we're actually in a way celebrating that wider place shaping role. I think we're building grounds for optimism. We're building grounds for success, and you know, to link it back to Paul's comments, we're building the sort of organisation that has got a fighting chance of addressing some of those big strategic issues and the challenges of the next few years. Whereas that old school, old style approach, it just gets overwhelmed very quickly, and then chopped off at the knees through salami slice budget cuts. So my message, looking at this from the other end of the telescope from Paul, as it were, is let's have a strategic narrative. Let's talk about themes. Let's talk about what we mean when we talk about place shaping, because we can have this conversation here, but we're a sort of almost like a closed conversation. We're the people who are having that conversation amongst ourselves, and we understand the terms on which we're having it. But planners' roles as place shapers, property surveyors, property professionals, housing professionals' roles as place shapers they're not universally embraced. They're not universally understood. We have to create that space and explain what that narrative and space means to others to enable them to engage in it. And I think in Dorset we're having some success on that front, and I have reasonable confidence that that sort of approach moves us into the place where some of those challenges that Paul was setting out become things that we can deal with, notwithstanding the fact that Dorset, like many other councils, faces pretty considerable challenges and pretty considerable budget reductions over the next few years.